Okay, everyone. Just before we get started, I'm just going to run through a little bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded, just to make you aware of that, so it will be made available on the PRONI YouTube channel. So please do turn your camera off if you don't want to appear on that. For question and answer, we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any, please do pop them into the chat and just say who they're for, and I will relay them to the speakers for you at the Q&A part at the end. That's it for housekeeping. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us as PRONI and the Royal College of Nursing Northern Ireland launch online the Biographical Dictionary of Nurses from Ireland, describing the lives of those nurses who served on the home front and on many battlefronts across the world during the Second World War. The publication is the first of its kind and is now available as an online searchable resource on the PRONI website. My colleague Grace has copied the URL link into the chat, so it's there and live now that you can go on and open that up now in your browser. I'm Gillian Doherty, I'm Deputy Head of Public Services at PRONI, and joining us tonight is Margaret Graham, Chair of the History of Nursing Northern Ireland Network, and Sean Graffin of the History of Nursing Northern Ireland Network and author of the database. Unfortunately, my colleague Des McCabe isn't able to join us this evening, but Des has worked along with Sean and Margaret to make the database available, and I just want to note the commitment and the work that Des put in, and sorry that he couldn't be here. After Margaret and Sean, we'll be hearing from artist Jill Phillips, whose exhibition Escapades opened today at PRONI and looks at the efforts made by the female factory workers in Northern Ireland to hook up with the servicemen. So we're in for a treat, a little bit risque at times. But before that, just for anyone who's not aware of PRONI, a little bit of an introduction. If you're not familiar with who we are. The Public Record Office of Northern Ireland was created under the Public Records Act of Northern Ireland 1923, and we are the official repository for Northern Ireland. So we're based in Titanic Quarter and just finishing our year-long centenary celebrations. The Act gives us the remit to collect both public and private records, and we have grown from having no records 100 years ago to over 3 million. Our job is to protect, preserve and make available the records, and that means not only through making records available on site, but also online and through valuable partnerships like this one. As part of the Department for Communities, it is important that we play our part in helping individuals and communities tell their stories and find their place in the world. So that highlights the importance of having this resource available on our website so that those who might be coming to the PRONI website to research their family or local history have access to such an invaluable resource that takes them down an avenue that they might not have known existed. The women whose lives are listed, they could have been anyone's sister, daughter, niece, cousin, often more than one from one family and many from small communities. So it's fitting that we are launching this as we celebrate International Women's Day on Friday and acknowledge the extraordinary actions of very ordinary women who served as nurses during the Second World War. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Margaret Graham and Sean Graffin to tell us more about the project.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Margaret Graham, and on behalf of the RCN History of Nursing Network, I just want to thank PRONI for facilitating this event for Sean and I to share the findings of our network's recent project, Nurses' Voices from the Second World War, the Ireland Connection. One of the major outcomes of our research has been Sean's meticulously researched dictionary, which we are delighted is going online and live tonight, courtesy of PRONI. Last November, we released a book of the same name and of the same title, funded by the Northern Ireland War Memorial Museum and the RCN Foundation, a nursing charity. Just some background information about our history network. It's been active for over 30 years, during which time many oral histories have been gathered, mostly from retired nurses, many who trained prior to the establishment of the NHS. In 2013, we published Nurses' Voices from the Northern Ireland Troubles, written narratives of nurses who had nursed through the Troubles. We then, with Heritage Lottery funding, researched local nurses who had served in the First World War to mark that war's centenary, the findings of which were presented at PRONI in 2018. Now we have researched the Second World War nurses. This was to be a small 2019 project to mark the then 75th anniversary of D-Day landings. However, when Sean began to uncover nurses from the Republic of Ireland who had lost their lives during Blitz attack in the United Kingdom, we realised we had to include their names. And then as Sean continued his research, more names from across Ireland were gathered, many of whom joined the Queen Alexandra Imperial Nursing Service as reserves, once they had completed nurse training in UK hospitals. And so the small project grew rather larger than anticipated, and research stretched from the COVID years until last May. As a group, we were shocked and saddened to discover that many QA nurses drowned at sea when troop ships suffered enemy attack. In all, we have a list of 50 nurses from Ireland who died as a consequence of the war. Most surprising to me was to discover that 5 Royal Victoria Hospital nurses where I trained had been killed during the war, 4 during the fall of Singapore, and 1 as a prisoner of war, all in unknown history. However, I will talk more about the nurses and share some of their experiences in their own words after Sean describes how he has researched the 600-odd names on his dictionary. You will realise how meticulous he has been, and we have been in awe of how much information he has gathered. So over to Sean.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you. Good evening to everybody who has joined us this evening. The name of my presentation is Nurses' Voices from the Second World War, Biographical Dictionary of Nurses from Ireland and their role during the Second World War, 1939 to 45. Initially, we had just called the project a database, but finally settled on Biographical Dictionary as it seemed a more accurate term. In the next 20 minutes or so, I intend to provide a brief outline of the background to the project, then give a summation of its aims. I will run through the main archival sources that were accessed online and utilised to glean information on the individual nurses. And finally, I will give a summary of the methodology behind creating the dictionary. Background. As a member of the History of Nursing Northern Ireland Network, I was involved in compiling a database of nurses from the island of Ireland who were active during the First World War. This was quite a modest piece of work which uncovered the biographies of approximately 150 nurses. Our network published a book in late 2017 to coincide with the ongoing commemoration of that terrible conflict, detailing Irish nurses' experiences of the war. The network then decided to undertake further research into nurses from the island of Ireland and their role in the Second World War as part of an intended commemoration of 75 years since the D-Day landings. Then COVID-19 happened and everything was put on hold, including our work. However, I was able to take advantage of the long hiatus that followed to conduct research into the Second World War nurses from Ireland using initially online sources. What started as a tentative research project quickly became a tsunami of data. The project grew exponentially over the next 3 years to encompass the biographical data of over 600 nurses from Ireland. I realised that I had seriously underestimated the amount of untapped material that was out there. Throughout the project, I had adopted the maxim from Blackstone's Police Operational Handbook, which recommends the ABC of serious investigation. A, assume nothing. B, believe nothing. And C, check everything. The aim of the research, to maintain some sort of coherent structure to the research, a clear objective was required. Essentially, the aim was to identify and explore the history of nurses from the island of Ireland who were involved in some way in the Second World War from 1939 to 45 and beyond. It was decided that this would best be addressed by asking several key questions. Who were these individual nurses? What were their social origins and religious background? What was their working life like during the Second World War, and what happened to them after the war? Not all of these questions could be answered completely for each individual nurse. The archival sources that we used. This work, the first of its kind, has attempted to compile a comprehensive list of those nurses born on the island of Ireland who made a significant contribution to the service effort during the Second World War, often risking their lives on the home front or on the battlefront lines in Europe or in the Pacific theatre. There is no simple official list available from which the names of these nurses can be collected. The Queen Alexandra Imperial Military Nursing Service records for this period will not be released from the National Archives at Kew for some time because of the 100-year rule. Accordingly, I made a start by examining the announcements of commissions in the military nursing services in the London Gazette and its supplement between the years 1939 and 1946. The London Gazette is one of the official journals of record or government gazettes of the UK government, and most important among such official journals in the United Kingdom, in which certain statutory notices are required to be published. During the war, lists of names of nurses who obtained commissions, promotion, or awards were recorded in the Gazette or its supplements on a weekly basis. The entries provide lists of names along with their service number only, and rarely disclose places of birth or origin, etc. Therefore, the selection of nurses from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland for this database was made using the unscientific method of recognising surnames common to the different parts of the island, for example, Murphy or Johnston. Paradoxically, as nurses from the Protestant community in Northern Ireland may hold surnames common in Scotland and or England, this method may indeed have resulted in a smaller proportion of Northern Ireland nurses represented than those from the Republic. The so-called Gaelic names are more easily identified, though of course not all of the nurses under such names were born in Ireland. There are some lists of the Queen Alexandra nurses available online, but these are unofficial and tend to reflect English and Scottish genealogical and historical interest. The potential names given by the London Gazette were then followed up by trawling a very wide variety of other sources. These only relate to nurses in the military nursing services. I utilised other sources to include in this list numbers of civilian nurses who found themselves involved in the rigours of the Blitz in different parts of the UK, several of whom were tragically killed. The biographies have been laid out in similar format to biographies assembled in the Directory of Ulster Doctors who qualified before 1901 by Professor Richard Clark from the Royal Victoria Hospital, and that was published in 2013. Data from official administrative sources such as nursing registration books, examination records, civil registration data, commission registers for the military units, service records have been supplemented by newspaper and other sources to create biographical frameworks for each nurse. These prove dates of birth, marriage and death, service numbers, names of parents, dates of registration, nursing registration that is, and the registration numbers, along with training hospitals, residences over time, commissions in the services, awards and medals, postings, and among other data. The archival records were consulted at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, where readily available in interviews, published studies or in obituaries, these skeleton biographies have been filled out by reminiscences or detailed descriptions of the lives and experiences of nurses, especially during the Second World War. And you'll hear some of that when Margaret does her talk. The main online archival sources consulted were the National Archives at Kew, including the nursing service records from the First World War. A number of nurses had previously served in the First World War, and their service records were an invaluable source of personal information. The Public Record Office of Northern Ireland in Belfast, the National Archives in Dublin, genealogy websites, Nursing Journal Archive online, and newspaper archives online. The primary sources then, as well as the online sources identified and trawled for information, I had previously visited the following sites in the early 2010s while carrying out research on Irish nurses in Britain. So I had accrued a great deal of data that was not available online. And as you can see there, in Belfast at the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, the Royal Victoria Hospital Archives in the King Edward VII building at the Royal Victoria Hospital site. In Dublin, the University College Dublin Archives, Edinburgh, the National Archives of Scotland, and London, the National Archives at Kew. Primary sources, newspapers, journals, and periodicals. An extensive range of newspapers were available to search online via the British Newspaper Archive website. And the Belfast-based newspapers were the main source of information Other major and provincial papers provide information on nurses, and I have included a full list of those that yielded useful information, both on this slide and the next one as well. Then, looking at the websites. The most used website in this was www.ancestry.co.uk, and most people will be aware of that. And the types of records that I used on that were the 1939, if we go back, Claire, please. With the 1939 England and Wales Register, immigration records, the London Gazette itself and its supplements, the UK and Ireland nursing registers, UK census from 1881 to 1911, and the military campaign medals and award rolls, and the civilian deaths 1939-45. Thank you. Then other websites then that were accessed with the British Newspaper Archive, which was really invaluable with the information from local newspapers. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Eccles Road Heritage, and the Eccles Road Heritage related to one of the nurses, Ross, who was from Ballymena and who was in England and played a big role in Eccles. Find My Past also has very useful information, and the key aspect of that is the UK census for 1921. Irish births, marriages and deaths from the General Register Office of Northern Ireland and the General Register Office of Ireland, and they are available online. The National Library of Ireland, looking at particularly the 1901 and the 1911 censuses, and the Scottish National War Museum. And what we have done here is I've got an extract from the supplement to the London Gazette for the 2nd of June 1942. And this shows you the section on women's forces and a list of names that follows. In the next slide then, and this, it's the same publication, but further on down, we have some potential names that were gleaned. And the two of them have been marked with blue arrows. First is Bridget Mary Shine and Joanna Hogan. And they were two individuals that then were nurses from Ireland, and I was able to follow up on them. Here we have then a page from the Register of Nurses for 1940 in London. And, sorry, just before that, in the next few slides, I will use as an example one individual nurse from the dictionary, Charlotte Florence Black, with some of the key material discovered in relation to her. And we have here a page from the Register of Nurses for 1940. And the second last name on the right-hand page, which is highlighted by the blue arrow, is Charlotte. And it shows that she trained at Weymouth and General District Hospital in Dorset from 1934 to 1938. And that she registered on the 10th of March 1939 in London, and at the time she was listed as living at 128 Folly Lane, Swinton in Lancashire. Then what I have got here is an entry from the Register of Births in Ireland 1910, and this is for Charlotte Florence Black, born the 3rd of September 1910 at 72 Sandhurst Gardens in Belfast. And she was the daughter of Robert Black, who was a lithographer, and Charlotte Black, née Dorothy, of 72 Sandhurst Gardens, Belfast. Following on from that, then, we have an entry from the Census of Ireland for 1911, and we have Charlotte marked with the blue arrow. And in this, Charlotte was still living at 72 Sandhurst Gardens in Belfast with her parents, along with her 3 brothers and 2 sisters. The next slide then takes us to the census in England in 1921. The Black family had moved to England some time prior to March 1921. And you can see Charlotte here. And this is the 19th of June. And the Black family are living at 21 Premier Street, Old Trafford in Manchester. And the family consisted of Robert Black, the father, who was now a widower, along with his 2 sons, Ernest and David, and the 2 daughters, Edith W. and Charlotte F. And Charlotte was aged 10 years and 9 months. Then we have here a page from the 1939 Register for England. And Charlotte Florence Black is highlighted with the blue arrow, and she was listed as a deputy sister at the Northern Hospital, Winchmore Hill, Southgate in London. Initially taken due to the onset of war with the purpose of producing national identity cards, the 1939 register later came to be a multifunctional, first as an aid in the use of ration books and later helping officials record the movement of the civilian population over the following decades, and from 1948 as a basis for the National Health Service Register. The 1939 register is a very important genealogical resource. The register is held by the National Archives, contains data only for England and Wales. And in it, the following information can be found: the name of the individual, their gender, their address at the time, the date of birth, which is not always correct, their marital status, occupation, whether a visitor, officer, servant, patient, or inmate, and inferred family members. Other members of the household, and when I say household, for example, in this particular instance, the hospital of Winchmore Hill, if you check through that, and that's what I would do, check through the names to see if there are other names of individuals who may be from Ireland and follow those up as well. And sometimes you may see extra information on the right-hand side of the image, such as whether an individual had volunteered as an air raid warden. Some records include names crossed out with another name written in an annotation above or at the side, signifying the tracking of the population over time with the addition of women's married names and other name changes over the years. And I found this to be a very useful resource in tracking a particular nurse. And we have then here a transcript of what we saw on the previous slide for Charlotte Florence Black. In this particular case, the transcript is accurate. However, in many cases, the information has not been transcribed properly, so it's always important to have checked the original source. Next slide then, what we have here is the Singapore Memorial. And Charlotte Florence Black is mentioned there, having died on the 24th of February 1942 in the Far East on war service. She's commemorated in this by the War Graves Commission at the Singapore Memorial column. On the memorial, her birth is incorrect. It's stated as 1916 instead of 1910, and her birthplace is also incorrect, recorded as Chorlton-cum-Hardy in the Metropolitan Borough of Manchester in England instead of Belfast. She is also commemorated on the Scottish National War Memorial, presumably because her father was Scottish. Meanwhile, in her home city of Belfast, she has been forgotten. This particular slide is a continuation of the previous one, and it actually relates centrally to Charlotte's final hours. Then the next slide, we have then Probate Register in England, 1947, Charlotte Florence Black. And her address then was 21 Premier Street, Manchester, described as a spinster who died the 24th of February 1942 in war service, and the administration in Manchester, 14th of January 47, to her father, Robert Black, of no occupation, it says, and her effects after she died was £160, 6 shillings and 9pence. You can see there with the war, she had died in 1942. And her probate wasn't granted until 1947 because of the upset with the war and everything else. And you find that with a lot of individuals who died during the war, that their estate wasn't settled until afterwards. And next slide then, what we have here is an example of an entry in the dictionary. This is for Violet Mary Armstrong, and provides all the key information here. And as I had said before, some of the entries are longer than others. This one covers just one single A4 page. The individual that we've been looking at there, Charlotte Florence Black, her biography covers 10 A4 pages. There are some variations in the spelling of names in the database, and I use the most common spelling for each individual. Some entries are more complete than others, and sometimes I've come across a number of biographies, potentially of those of the nurse being described. For example, you might have had, say, 4 Bridget Murphys in one particular county and in one particular area. and it was difficult to differentiate because they were all born around about the same time in the same sort of locale, so you couldn't identify which particular one was the one that was mentioned in the war records. And so in that particular case, the practice has been to include each one for the reader to make the final decision based on information that they may have or until more information becomes available. Where the data is unclear or debatable, question marks have been placed in the text to acknowledge this doubt. This work remains, however, by no means complete to date, and research continues. Further research needs to be carried out once the records become available, and this will, we hope, result in a more complete second edition at a future date. And at this point, I just want to take a moment to thank Gillian Doherty of PRONI and the staff there for all their help in getting the dictionary up and running on their site. I particularly wish to thank Desmond McCabe for all his efforts to get the dictionary where it is today. Des can't be with us tonight, but I want to acknowledge him. He did all the heavy lifting from PRONI's end, and he was extremely helpful and supportive of our project. And for any further questions or information, I can be contacted at this email address. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm sure everybody listening in will agree that Sean's research has been very time-consuming and thorough, giving nurses from Ireland a history not previously known or recognised. So just something more about the life of the nurses during the Second World War. During the Second World War, nurses worked on home fronts and the many battlefronts in Europe, North Africa, Middle East and Far East. What is striking in our findings is that the World War did not deter nurses from the Republic of Ireland applying to train in UK hospitals. Ireland during the 1920s suffered turbulent times, including partition. There were few opportunities for nurses to train in Ireland, and for women, nursing was a profession which could provide independence and security, and probably a sense of adventure. When war broke out in 1939, women from the Republic continued to apply to hospitals in the UK. During Blitz attack on the major industrial cities across the UK, including Belfast, many hospitals were damaged or hit directly. Christmas 1940, Manchester and Salford were attacked, and Hope Hospital Salford took a direct hit, killing a number of staff, including the matron Mary Jane Colvin Ross from Ballymena. Matron Ross was a veteran of the First World War. Later in 1941, Salford again was bombed. 14 off-duty nurses were killed in this attack, 4 of whom were from Ireland. And later again, 2 other Irish nurses were killed during a bombing raid in 1944. The London Blitz began on the 7th of September 1940. The nightly bombing continued for 11 weeks. It must have been a frightening experience for nurses to hear bombs exploding for hours on end, many of which hit hospitals. Hospital staff had to work in basements with emergency lighting, frequently having to improvise treatment and care. Over 20 nurses from Ireland, North and South, were killed in these attacks. May Dolan from County Cavan was killed running to an air raid shelter. When her belongings were returned to the family, an unopened letter from her boyfriend had a proposal of marriage. Bella O'Donnell from Ballymena volunteered to go back on duty and was killed during an attack trying to move patients to safety. Mary Morris from Galway, a probationer nurse in London during the Blitz, survived and joined the QAs to serve mostly in France. The following 2 extracts are from a diary she kept, provide some insight into the dangers faced. May the 11th, 1941. A whining, shuddering like an express train leaving a tunnel. The air shook with a volcanic rumbling, and a marble pillar in the centre of the room cracked like a tree trunk. In the maelstrom of dust, tumbling masonry and splintered woodwork, people were screaming. There came a Niagara stream of plaster, dust and dust. I realised that I should be helping people, not just standing there frozen with horror. The 26th of March 1944, when alone on night duty, looking after 32 children with whooping cough, she noted, "I heard the whine of the air raid warning. followed soon by a telephone call to say all the children to the underground cellar. I tried to get all the children wrapped up warmly. The all clear and the porter sent to help arrived simultaneously. What a night. Here, during the Belfast Blitz, a wing of the Ulster Hospital for Children and Women in Templemore Avenue was hit by high explosives. A newspaper report quoted the doctor saying, "I never saw fear exhibited by any member of staff, and when one reflects that many of them were young girls in their teens, one can see what a feat of courage they performed in sticking to their posts." The Mater Hospital Belfast, like other hospitals, had detailed contingency plans for all staff. On the night of the 15th of April 1941, a number of incendiary bombs directly hit the hospital roof and the nurses' home was set ablaze. With the hospital at the centre of the attack, many casualties arrived. Medical and nursing staff worked unceasingly for 36 hours to try and save as many lives as possible. Sadly, the death toll from that night was 740. Nancy Duncan from Fintna, who nursed in the Royal Maternity Hospital during the Blitz, remembered working by the light of a Tilly lamp when the electricity was cut. Surgeons worked by the light of a hurricane lamp at a time when anaesthetics were applied by dripping a highly inflammable mixture of chloroform and ether onto an open mask. It's difficult to imagine the fear of working through these Blitz attacks, and yet there are many documented incidents of nurses receiving bravery awards. Irish nurses Mary Fleming and Aileen Turner received the George Medal for bravery in removing 17 patients to safety, having crawled through windows and along swaying floors to reach trapped patients before the floor collapsed. They were quoted as saying, "We were just doing our duty." Staff nurse Patricia Marmion and matron Catherine McGovern, a World War I veteran, also received George Medals, both nurses from Ireland. Abroad, frontline nurses also showed great resilience and determination to continue caring for casualties in the face of danger. The presence of nurses based close to front lines was recognised by the senior military as morale boosting for the troops. Nurses who enlisted as reservists were mostly young and newly qualified. They underwent military training in fitness, learnt to pack military hospitals, and had training in the management of trauma and infectious diseases. Nurses were deployed on every front line, working in extremes of climate, hot and cold, wet and dry, exposed to air raids, poisonous insects, and scorpions and infectious disease. They slept in trenches, under canvas, and if fortunate, in buildings. Water was frequently rationed, making washing a luxury. During peak battle surges and on any front, they got little sleep, as hundreds of casualties could arrive en masse. Theatres were in constant use. Amputations, fractures, burns, and head injuries were common. Nurses had to work quickly and efficiently to triage the many casualties admitted. TB and dysentery were common in the Far East and North Africa, and serious outbreaks very difficult to isolate and contain. Battle fatigue and shell shock were disturbing to manage. During the Burma campaign, malaria incapacitated huge numbers of troops, and many nurses also succumbed to the disease, resulting in a greatly overstretched medical corps. Nurses had to be inventive in delivering care. Nancy Duncan, who served in North Africa, recounted that rats could develop a taste for plaster of Paris. Bed legs were often placed into buckets of paraffin or petrol to prevent insects crawling up into mattresses. Writing for the 1975 RVH League of Nurses magazine, Sister Nora Earls from Belfast described her experience during the Second Battle of Tobruk, North Africa. Every night there were air raids sweeping over the roof of the hospital. Water was a problem. A ration of brackish water washed us, then our clothes, and then the floor of our rooms. Pure water was brought down by ship from Alexandria and used for cooking and tea making. Only very seriously ill patients were kept more than one night. The medical staff warned us that as nurses we would have to forget our conservative attitude to morphia and other drugs and give them to all ill and nervous patients before the nightly raids. As there was no running water, basins filled with disinfectant were used, instruments kept in Dettol, theatre instruments sterilised using large old Primus stoves. One day we were told that we had to leave. None of us wished to go but had to obey orders. Leaving patients, shortly all were taken prisoner. Moving on to the war at sea. Military hospitals and medical team deployments by troop ship to oversee front lines were not without danger, as troop ships were exposed to enemy attack. Nurses and crew faced many dangers when having to escape from a damaged ship. One risk being the discharge of tons of burning fuel. Also, not all personnel aboard were able to reach lifeboats, and many nurses who jumped from sinking ships were not able to swim and tried to grab something to use as a float. It must have been a terrifying experience to put on a life jacket and jump into the sea, not knowing if you would survive. Over 20 nurses have been identified as being killed during enemy attack at sea. In February 1944, the SS Khedive Ismail was attacked on its way to support the Burma campaign. 1,297 people lost their lives, including 77 women, in the 2 minutes it took the ship to sink. 9 nurses from Ireland, North and South, lost their lives. These included 2 sisters from County Cavan, Winifred and Margaret Kells. One of our members recognised the name and knew of the family, and so as a consequence we were able to get these family photographs. Beatrice Dowling from Bestbrook, County Armagh, also perished in this attack. This remarkable first-hand abridged account of survival and resilience was written by Belfast nurse Jean Dixon. Jean doesn't name the ship, but it's most probably the Strathallan. We were all awakened sometime in the night with a terrific jolt which shot everything movable, including us, to the floor. As we picked ourselves up, somebody came running down the corridor shouting, "Boat stations immediately." The lights had failed and the ship was listing badly. We groped about hurriedly to get coats or something to cover up our night attire and went on deck. Lifeboats were being lowered hastily and rafts were being thrown overboard for all those already swimming about in the sea. 6 sisters, including myself, got into a boat full of men. There was barely standing room, and after dragging in as many as possible from the sea, we drifted away. In what seemed a remarkably short space of time, we lost sight of all the other ships and appeared to have the Mediterranean to ourselves. The few who had tin hats passed them round for the less fortunate to be sick in, as it was impossible to move, much less get to the side of the ship. We saw the moon go down and the sun come up, and in between periods of being sick, we all sang the songs we knew. After 8 hours of drifting, we were picked up by a destroyer, and the boys on that ship were kindness itself. Sadly, 5 nurses died during the sinking of the ship, 1 from Ireland. For me, one of the most distressing episodes to discover were the events which happened during the evacuation of Singapore. The SS Kuala, a small ship, was one of the last to leave Singapore before the island surrendered in February 1942. It set off with about 600 people crammed aboard. Most of the passengers were women and children, and also on the ship were the remaining 50 nurses who had volunteered to remain behind with their patients until they too were ordered to leave. The ship came under heavy air attack. Passengers jumped into the sea and tried to find something to hold on to. Those who survived made it to the nearby island of Pompong, where the nurses attended to the needs of the injured as best they could. A rescue ship, the Tanjong Penang, also came under attack. The attack and sinking of both vessels resulted in the death of 5 nurses, with 2 surviving. Edith Doreen Pedlow and Molly Cooper survived the attack on the Tanjong Penang and drifted on a raft for 3 days. The Belfast Telegraph reported that on that raft, Doreen Pedlow breathed her last, still wearing her badge as a nurse of the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast. Her companion took the badge and pinned it next to her own, that of the Adelaide Hospital, Dublin. The survivors on the raft were captured by the Japanese and interned. In the camp, she too died, tended by a third nurse, who took the two badges and eventually brought them home to Ireland. The Adelaide nurse was probably Molly Cooper from Carrickmacross, County Monaghan. Both she and Ruth Dixon from Eggish, County Tyrone, who survived the attack on the koala, died from disease and malnutrition in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. In June 1944, the operation to land troops on the beaches of northern France began, marking the start of a long and arduous campaign in northern France. Casualties were high. Maureen Murphy, QA from Galway, arrived on the Normandy beaches 3 days after the initial landing. She noted in her memoir, "We were very busy for the first few months, sometimes working day and night, and only a few hours rest. When wards ran out of beds, another tent was erected." Maureen Gara from County Donegal was also part of the contingent of nurses to arrive immediately after D-Day. She had a distinguished military nursing career, and her obituary noted that following D-Day, she clambered down a scramble net into a landing craft, only to find that rough seas prevented the vessel from reaching shore for 4 hours. She spent her first night on land in trenches with a 24-hour ration pack for sustenance. Finally, after 11 months of hard fighting, victory in Europe was declared. However, this was not the end of the war, as the horror of the Holocaust unfolded in the discovery of concentration camps. Nurses now had to manage caring for survivors suffering malnutrition and disease. An army major remarked how the nurses never flinched. A number of the nurses identified cared for those incarcerated in these camps. Sister Gertie Moutry from County Tyrone, along with others, was flown into Belsen-Bergen. She never spoke of her experience, but wrote in a diary, "One large tent had been erected for us. We were given an army blanket and a glass of rum. We wrapped ourselves in the blanket, lay down on the floor of the tent and went to sleep. I will never forget how sad it was to be one of the nurses here. I am at the same time glad that I might help the people and care for the wounded. To witness the horror and suffering caused by war. I hope this is the war to end all wars." After victory in Europe Day, many nurses remained in Europe to care for the prisoner of wars, refugees and displaced civilians. There was much humanitarian work to be undertaken after 5 years of war. Other nurses were deployed to the Far East as Japan was still engaged in the war. Deployment to India and Burma was a different climate and culture, and to many of the nurses from Ireland or any nurse it must have taken some time to acclimatise. Betty Boyce, who trained in the RVH, wrote, "India presented many difficulties to the unwary. Beyond trying to learn a few words of Urdu on the ship on the way out, we were in no way prepared for life in a military hospital in India. Language and religion were a problem at first. It was hard to remember differences between a Hindu and a Muslim. Gurkhas and Sikhs were easily recognised, and that you must never handle any food on its way to a patient. A ward sister in England is so used to making something special for her very ill patient, serving the meal or helping a helpless patient with his food, that it was hard at first to realise that if she touched it, she rendered it unclean and out it had to go." The major transformation treatment of the Second World War was the mass production of penicillin, which was developed and produced en masse in time for the D-Day Normandy landings. From written and oral histories, it's clear that nurses were amazed at this wonder drug, which saved many lives. And note that at this time, plastic as we know it was not in use. Glass syringes had to be sterilised and needles were reused. Nursing notes record that needles should be checked for bluntness and rust-free. Penicillin was given intramuscularly 4 hourly, so you can imagine how busy these rounds must have been. The dropping of the atom bombs on Japan ended the war. For our nurses in the Far East, it was caring for the released prisoners of war as systems were put in place to return these troops and civilians home. Finally, as nurses were demobbed, it was returned to Civvy Street again. I haven't mentioned the social lives of our nurses, but for many romance blossomed, and there were many marriages both during and after the war. Mary Murphy from Galway met Dr. Ian Kerr, GP, and settled in Garva, County Londonderry. Hazel Kennedy from Belfast met Donald Shaw, a vet from Scotland. Many emigrated overseas, and it's to be remembered at this time married women were not accepted for work, and many hospital authorities wanted nurses to live on site. For those nurses who returned here to Northern Ireland, many held senior positions as the new NHS was introduced, no doubt using their experience and skills. Some were still in post when I started my training, yet there was no mention that they were war veterans. This run-through is only a snapshot of what we have discovered about our past nursing history. It's been a sobering discovery, but as a group we've been able to make direct contact with a number of families and collect their photographs, and we hope that the sacrifice of these nurses will now be recognised through these findings, and the dictionary will assist relatives who may be unaware of this remarkable history. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret and Sean. Wow. I don't think there's anyone listening who couldn't be in awe of all of those nurses that you've just spoken about, and in no doubt about the importance of the dictionary to remember those nurses and their sacrifice and their bravery. I have lots of questions for you, but I'm going to leave those just to the end. I'm just for now going to move on to Jill. And I know, Margaret, you had touched there on relationships and nurses who got married, and it kind of leads us on to Jill Phillips. Jill Phillips is an artist whose exhibition opened today in PRONI. And it touches on what, against that backdrop, that we realise that normal life things still continue, such as relationships and wanting to meet someone. And so Jill's exhibition opened today, looking at those relationships for women who were at home and working in the factories, and their efforts to meet someone and have relationships. So I'm just going to pass over now to you, Jill, to tell us more.
Thank you very much, Gillian. So I'd just like to welcome you tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Escapades. Firstly, though, I am going to talk a little bit about some exhibitions that I've previously done. So this is Different Buses, and this was a Code Red exhibition for Craft NI. It was based in Armagh in the early 1980s. It was about two girls' school. In Armagh, the uniform was exactly the same, apart from the colour of their shirt and the school logo, and of course the buses that they got home. So the collection of work examined the similarities, that we were all basically the same in body structure, yet at that point in time they were so far apart in many other ways. So then if we go on to Contemporary Souvenir, this was a collection that I completed, a group exhibition that was exhibited at Ormo-Bath's Gallery in Belfast. Here we examined the idea of the souvenir and what it meant to us as a group. And we were trying to make it more contemporary at the time. So the image on the left, we have the Belfast skyline, which is laser engraved into wood alongside printed stamps which came off postcards. The right-hand image is printed stones and driftwood alongside laser-cut linen and printed forks. So this was really just to sort of explore what we actually thought was a souvenir and how we could connect with them more. Linen Diaspora was a group exhibition that went to the Smithsonian Gallery in Washington. I worked with Derek Wilson, a ceramicist, on this. We provided a body of work researching gatherings at the table. By examining linen and delf, we then looked for new ways to portray those products. For my part, I took a very traditional linen tablecloth, a shamrock design, combined with technology, and I created new 3D pieces using printers and laser cutters to enhance shape, form, and depth. And then going on to immersed. This was shown at the F.E. McWilliam Gallery. And this is when I started to explore looking at historical stories and creating designs from that. So within this, there is hidden imagery, which I placed in a traditional Irish design. The design was then created by using a laser cutter to engrave into the linen. This creates a 3D effect depending on what you leave and what you strip away. The 2 layers of acrylic in front of the linen was also laser etched to increase the overall 3D effect of the whole piece. Immersed is about James Quinn, an Irishman who created the first jacquard loom in the world. So then we move on to Escapades, which was a beautiful exhibition for me to create. This is an examination into the codes used in letters during the war. Now, this project started with Elizabeth Cairns. She was born in 1925. And by the time of the Second World War, she was working in a local shirt factory. She revealed stories of women placing their addresses into the shirt pockets of the uniforms that they were stitching, in the hope that they received a reply. So one of the delights was a tea break when all the girls would gather. They would swap notes and discuss the replies that they had got. After further examination, I found that correspondence between men and women at war and those still at home was everything, from a glorious distraction to a support mechanism when times were tough. The codes were funny and poignant, and some serious, but all of them allowed the freedom of speech and emotion at a time of great distress. I just want to tell you a little bit about the technology that I used during this. Again, I was looking at the stories, but with the codes, I wanted to acknowledge the past and to combine it with today's technology. So I used the laser cutter as an engraver, stripping away part of the paper within the envelope to create a lace-like design. And then obviously there is good and bad days, and I'm going to show you one of my bad days. So just as you think you're getting it finished and it's almost there, it just blows away and everything is destroyed. So there's a real intricacy in working in this way to try and gain this lace within the design. It's really important that I had worked alongside the technique itself. Was a lot of research completed utilizing the power of the laser versus the speed at which the laser moves, so that the paper didn't burn or get cut through. And when you got it right, you had the good days. The designs are traditional damasks incorporating and altered with hidden imagery to represent codes and the ladies in the tea rooms. The center design, you can see 2 sets of figures dancing, and hopefully on this image you'll see how delicate the whole process was. And next I'm going to tell you some of the ones that I've done, because there's 14 or 15 in total. So this is a really cheeky one. This is Norwich, which is knickers off ready when I come home. So the hidden imagery within this design is a female's legs kicked up in the air, and she has a beautiful pair of stilettos on. So that's incorporated in around the traditional Irish damask, which once again harks back to the tea rooms that the girls would have been in. Snafu is one which isn't so nice, but it was part of what was going on at the time, and that situation normal, all effed up. So it's one of the more poignant ones. Inside it, there are hidden soldiers which blend in and out of the damask designs in the background. Leah is the one you didn't want, which was lost in action. So within this, if you can see, you look for the men's head and shoulders. It's almost within an apple shape in the top right-hand corner. And if you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a swirl. On top of the swirl, you'll see the silhouette of a woman with a suitcase and 3 children. Hopefully they're okay to see on the screen. If we move on to Malaya, that's my ardent lips await your arrival. So within the design, you can see the 2 sets of figures almost like they're re-mating within. So here you can see the really delicate nature of the envelope and how almost a layer has been stripped away, and then it looks like lace. So the collection really wanted to embody everything that I had found out, and I wanted it to be represented in the information. So I had used the vintage envelopes as my canvas, and that represented the letters that the girls were getting and sending. The addresses on the envelopes epitomise Miss E. Kearns and all her comrades and friends. The linen damask designs taken from Irish linen tablecloths embody the tea break room and the girls sharing their replies over a cuppa. The codes are shared and emerged within each envelope design in the form of the address and the imagery. Within the imagery, and as within the letters, there are hidden representations of the code and what it meant. And if you look closely, there is much to discover. So I would just like to thank PRONI, and I'm delighted to be part of this project and just to sort of encompass another section of what had gone on around the same time.